Good evening to all of you. Welcome back to this. This lecture series is being conducted by the School of Language, Literature and Culture Studies of the Swami Ramanand Teerth Marathwada University, Nanded. This lecture series is primarily meant for the undergraduate and postgraduate students of English literature. However, the wider community can also be benefited by this series, as this is going to be a YouTube live. We have with us Dr. Rahul Pungaliya. He already delivered one lecture yesterday. In continuation with that, he is going to speak on the same topic, Marxism and literature. Today, he is going to focus on some of the Marxists who contributed to the development of Marxian literary theory. The theorists which he is going to speak more about are Antonio Gramsci, George Lukács, Theodore Adorno, and Voloshinov. So I hope you all enjoy his talk and hope that you be connected with this channel ahead. We are going to have a few more lectures in the days to come. Some of these lectures will be through Google Meet. Not all the lectures will be on YouTube live platform. So we request you all to join the Telegram channel called FLLCS Events. This is a Telegram channel on which we will make available all the necessary details of this lecture series. So please join this channel and hope that you keep yourself associated with this school. So I welcome Dr. Rahul Pungaliya. I also thank him for inviting for accepting the invitation and delivering these lectures. So now I request Dr. Rahul to start.
Good evening, all. I found it to be a very exciting 2 days, yesterday and today, because Dilip gave me the opportunity to talk about Marxism and its connection with culture, art, and literature. I took this as a kind of a opportunity to go back to my work, research work, and my long time interest is in Marxist aesthetics and aesthetics proper. And I do believe that Marxism, if properly understood and not in the positivist and mechanistic way about which I talked yesterday, can create an epistemology, a philosophy, and philosophy of art, which is as good as any other philosophy. So let me begin today from where I left. Yesterday, I talked primarily about the philosophical origins of Marxism, and I tried to locate these origins in German idealism. And I said that Marx was not a determinist materialist as he is made out to be, but he is quite alive to the idea of human agency and the idea that human beings can and understand the world only with their capacities. But unlike proper idealism, Marx added that it is not just thought or the contemplation or thinking which Kant had foregrounded, the categories of thought a priorize, like space, time, causality, notions of oneness and sameness, etc. So all these, the ideas or the conceptual apparatus that human beings have as it as human beings try to take stock of the world around them. So only this is not enough. But Marx went further and he said that, following Hegel, that the entire social history, the entire history of knowledge and history of human civilization is the human effort or human capacity to understand the world. So it is human activity, the physical activity of creating civilization, of creating the society, uh, creating wealth for survival. So all these human activities are important to uh, formulate the conception of the world. So it is not just an intellectual activity, but the labor or the work of generations. So here there are two things. One is the idea that the physical activity or the labor and the mental activity, which both of them are result of the freedom that Kant was so keen to preserve. So these free human activities, both the contemplative activity of thought as well as the work which transform nature into wealth, into usable things, and so these activities kind of were human instruments to understand the world. So it was not just the subjective kind of mental apparatus, but the actual physical intervention in the reality around, which made the understanding of the world possible. So the objectivist bias was, in a way, kind of foreign to Marx, as it was for the entire tradition of German idealism. The German idealist tradition, to which I feel Marx belongs, was more dialectical. It included the subject and object both in its understanding of the world. Second thing that Marx especially got from Hegel is, it was not one ego in isolation, one subject in isolation, which understands the universals of the world, but it is the entire species, the entire humanity, which understands the world. Now, all these concepts, philosophical concepts, are extremely necessary to understand Marxist contribution to literary theory and literary world. How we will come to that. I also talked about the economics that Marx developed, and how kind of he talked about commodity production, fetishization. So here he is very specific. He is talking about the society in which he lived and society which in which we live, because capitalism is still the stage of mankind which we have not yet overcome, which we have not yet passed. So what Marx, I mean, of course it has gone through several transitions. Instead of simple industrial capital, it has turned into finance capital. It has become a global capital, and one can perhaps even say that it is post capitalism. But the core of capitalist economics continue to operate, and Marx analyzed them, and he talked about commodity production, extraction of surplus value in the sphere of production, and fetishization, uh, the replacement of exchange value for use value, and all these things. So these things yesterday we talked about, and we'll see today how they get used by Marxist theoreticians of culture and art. Before going to that, I will take you for a short survey of one small part of Marx's early work called Economic and Philosophical Manuscripts, where he talks about alienation and estrangement. This phenomenon of estrangement is very important to understand. It is a kind of, a subjective phenomenon, and we know that writing is to a degree highly subjective kind of an activity and highly individual kind of activity. At least to a certain degree, writers, artists do enjoy freedom, which industrial production and producers in industry do not enjoy. So, of course, there is something called phenomenon of culture industry, which about which Adorno talks about, and which was later taken up by people like Raymond Williams and Stuart Hall, and the group which studied culture in Britain. So, there is something called culture industry. So, there are pulp novels, there is Hollywood and Bollywood entertainment, there are television serials, there are web serials, and so on and so forth. So there is something called mass produced culture, in which the freedom of the creator obviously warps. But as far as the traditional ways of literature go, it is the author or the poet or the dramatist who works in relative isolation and has got relative autonomy and relative freedom. And this makes it pertinent for us to talk about the issue of uh, alienation, or issue of the role of subject or the situation of subject in a organized capitalist society, uh, towards which Marx uh, directed his attention pretty early in his intellectual career. So what he says is that uh, the kind of when a capitalist mode of production comes about, then the labor, the yesterday we talked about the economic nitty-gritties of this entire process. Today I'm going to talk about more psychological and philosophical aspects of it. So what Marx says is that the product of labor is the labor congealed in the object. I mean, just as Kant says that you create the world as you see it, your act of seeing, act of understanding, using. I mean, the world is in a way kind of, constructed by human mind. So the object is constructed by human cognition. In the same way, Marx says that it is the labor which creates the product, but the product appears something alien to the labor. The labor gets congealed in the object and it becomes alienated, or it appears to be objective reality, and a reality against which the human being, the laborer, has to strive. So realization of labor is its objectification. But uh, this objectification does not mean mastery over the object that a worker has created, because this is a capitalist mode of production. And out here, instead, what happens is, as you more and work more and more, you objectify your labor more and more, the object is lost to you. The object is owned as a commodity by the capitalist, because the capitalist owns the means of production. The worker does not own the means of production. And as a result, consists the laborer, and this object is turned into capital, the future capital. This object is transformed into money, and money becomes the capital, and the laborer becomes bonded to the object that he himself has produced. So this kind of, and the object that he has produced, he has to buy it as a commodity, not as a use value, but as an exchange value. So this is a loss and slavery, new kind of slavery, which is created out of your own work. So when you appropriate the nature, you get alienated from nature. So this is a kind of a paradoxical situation. You work, more you work, actually work should liberate you, work should connect you with the world. Instead, the world gets separated from you, estranged from you. Now, the worker is tied to object as a bonded labor in two ways. One, this object is given to him as an employment. It is object of work. So if he does not receive this object of work, since he does not own the means of production, if he does not receive this object of work, then he will starve to death. I mean, all that he is working for his physical existence. And the second way the object comes to him as a means of subsistence or as a means for physical existence. So it is not out of some creative joy that he derives from the object. He does not realize his potential and the potential of the world through the act of making, but it is not in his control as employment, and he has to buy it from his wages as a means of subsistence. So he existence is reduced to being just a physical being, a living being. Later, this entire process is going to be called reification by George Lukács, with little advancement, with little changes, and he is going to use that as a very potent tool to analyze literature. So this is a very important aspect of, Marxist theory, which later is going to fructify into Lukács's criticism of modern literature. So the worker, which is the majority, I mean, workers form the majority of human beings because the wealth is concentrated and centralized in fewer and fewer hands. So most of the human beings are reduced to just subsistence level and reduced to being alienated from their work and finding themselves separated from the reality. The whole reality, which is man made, the whole reality, the buildings that you see, the roads, and you own nothing of it. So the whole reality of your own making stands as the other, stands as something scary, which is threatening. And in such a situation, Lukács is going to conclude that modernist writers try to escape into their interiority, into their minds. But we'll come to that later. We will continue with Marx's analysis of the phenomenon of estrangement of worker, the alienation of worker from the object of work, and from the whole wealth, social wealth that he himself or she himself uh, uh, creates. So now, this alienation is often compared by Marx with religion. Just as man creates gods and then worships them, and worships them as stronger, wiser, more potent than him, though they are his own creations, though gods are historical entities, they are created historically. So you can locate when a particular god was born and what kind of society created that kind of god. But at the same time, this god becomes a supreme being over and above the creator, and the devotee completely surrenders to the god. In the same way, the god of the modern world is the commodity. So uh, here, Marx's critique of religion is kind of metaphorical about commodity. I mean, he does not talk about the ancient world or the medieval world as such, but he uses that as a metaphor for the modern society. And let us, limit it to that, because a comprehensive analysis of religion is yet to be done in Marxist thought. So one should not look at it as Marxist serious analysis or comment on religion, as much as a metaphor that he uses to analyze the commodity production in modern market societies. Now, Marxists believe that uh, it is human beings who create the world around him, is his humanism. Now, that yesterday I was talking about, that he belonged to this Enlightenment humanist kind of school, of which, of course, he was critical. He was not a complete camp follower of that school, but he took a position which at the same time was tinged with humanist tendencies, but at the same time it was reflective upon those tendencies. Now, Marx says that the alienation of worker from the work, from the object of work, from the act of production is threefold. One is the object is alien, and how I described just few minutes back, it is alien as the object of survival as well as the object of employment. Then second is the act of labor is suffering, it is burdensome. No worker likes to go on work, including teachers. So everybody enjoys holiday. So why should holiday be so important in our lives? If we had enjoyed our work, then there would be no need of holidays. So the leisure hour becomes something which in which you are free, and the working hours is something in which you are bonded. And this is very sad, because the majority of your creative productive activity becomes a burden for you, and your leisure hour, in which you do not produce anything but you satisfy only your physical needs, you eat, sleep, and uh, reproduce. So these physical animal activities become human activities. This is what Marx says about leisure hour. So the entire kind of emphasis on the physicality of man is something that Marx noticed, and you will find that in modern literature too. And the then the third kind of alienation is, it is alienation from the nature. So actually, man became man, the essence of man, or the species being, this is the word used by Marx, of man, is that man freely, consciously operates on the nature around it. I mean, all animals operate upon nature around it. If animals are hungry, they hunt or they graze. They Some animals are clever enough to build their homes, such as ants or bees, but these are instinctive activities. Human beings uh, do that as a distinctive activity which makes them human being. So it is a kind of an essential activity for human beings to create, to operate on nature in a very conscious way. So the I mean, there is a famous quote by Marx in which he compares bees and ants with engineers. So he says that the best bees and the worst engineer, the difference is, or the worst maker, the craftsman, the difference is that a craftsman or an engineer, howsoever moderately endowed he or she is doing that work consciously. Now this conscious work or free work on nature, which Marx calls the inorganic body of man. So nature is not something which is away from man, because away from nature man cannot survive. Man's material for work, man's body is nature. Man is fed by nature. So this nature appears as his work and reality when in freedom. But estrangement under capitalism turns a free activity into a compulsory activity, into a servitude, into a means of existence, just survival. And this is the third kind of alienation. Now, as a result of all these three kinds of estrangement, what you further have is man's estrangement from man, or creation of classes, the exploiting class and the exploited class. Because who is going to keep man in servitude? Not nature, not God. God cannot force human beings into slavery, because gods don't have any agency. Gods are created by human beings themselves. It is other men who convert human beings into slaves, and that's why you have two classes. It is only a man who can take away another man's labor. Okay, so this is the kind of Marxist thought on alienation. You see this phenomenon of alienation in 20th century literature when you read, for example, Sartre's novels, or Jean Genet's works, plays such as Mates, where you have free human beings who are alienated from their work. Sartre takes example of a waiter. For all appearances, he is a perfect waiter, but he is always playing up to it, because he is not really a waiter, he is a human being. And so what he has to do is play act being a waiter. So this is the kind of understanding of Marx we will take along with us when we deal with the literary analysis of Marxist critics. And as a, I mean, first thing now you have to realize is this is a kind of, a super addition, a kind of subsumption of reality by a fantastic world of market and commodities. And this is where the alienation takes place. Now, this alienation is a kind of falseness, or it is an ideological product. It is a superstructure, which kind of makes for false consciousness. This is a term that we will come across often when you read Marxism. So, the ideology or false consciousness or the untruth of living is what Marx is talking about. And he relegates the entire culture in the area of this falseness. So, I mean, I'll talk about, Marxist views on culture and literature, so that you know the kind of, extreme position that he takes about these things. The entire social life, political life, intellectual life, legal, religious, aesthetic, philosophical life, all these are the ideological forms of reality. The entire market also. So the entire kind of commodity exchange is also in a way an ideology. I mean, of course, ideology does not mean real, that it is not real. It is real. The false consciousness is really a false consciousness. Ideology exists not as something, I mean, it is not a hallucination, it's not a dream, but it's a reality, but it is the reality which has hidden the true nature of man. It is a distorted kind of a world. True nature of man is free creation for each other's needs, development of one and development of all, with cooperative work, with a kind of common consciousness of unity of mankind. This is the free kind of, this is the true nature of mankind. But in capitalism, what you have is a distorted kind of a world where market sits on top of the actual production process, which is done with huge cooperation. Without cooperation, the modern industry just can't work. But you see in market and everywhere competition. So competition is the ideological form and cooperation is the real form. but competition appears to be, I mean, everybody is taught to compete with everybody else. Everybody is taught to think that the other person is his rival or her rival. And the even the field of literature or the field of art does not escape this. So this even the so-called fields which are supposed to be free of the market sphere, where you can you have a chance to uh, greet the other person as a creator of new ideas. Even here the competition kind of works, and these kind of an ideological world is formulated, or the superstructural world is formulated by spheres which are not directly involved in production, such as the law, the politics, the philosophy, the intellectual world, education, religion, arts, culture, literature, and so on and so forth. But these world is the world about which Marxist literary critics and theorists of art have to talk about, because uh, that is the world which, though it is false, influences man's idea of his own existence. And uh, the analysis of this kind of cultural world is in a way going to give an exact picture of how the human beings collectively delude themselves into believing something which is not, or something which is false. And that is what Marxist literary theory is all about. That is what Marxist cultural analysis is all about. So if you take Gramsci or Althusser or Adorno or Lukács, all of them are talking about basically the ideological world as they find it in art, literature, in commercial culture, in culture industry, or the hegemonic ideas, the politics, and law, education, and so on and so forth. Now, some common quotations I'll have to quote, and of course, I will have certain reservations about them. I mean, but these are kind of words from Marx himself, but they have become basis for most of Marxist literary criticism. And let me read out from those lines by Marx, which have shaped Marxist literary theory. Now, all of them are very famous lines, but, and we will try to get into more subtle analysis, nuanced analysis of them. But let me first introduce you to those lines. Marx says that the ideas of the ruling class in every epoch are the ruling ideas. So the here, I mean, he makes a kind of clean division that it is the ideas of ruling class which rule the ideas of the entire society, because this is a leisure class. This is a class which has got time to create ideas. Working men and women do not have time, leisure hour, for intellectual pursuits. It is the upper classes, I mean, I'm speaking very crudely, which create these ruling ideas. He also further says the class which is the ruling material force of society is at the same time its ruling intellectual force. So the class which is the ruling class in the society is also the ruling intellectual force. And then he says that the ruling ideas are the ideal expressions of the dominant material relations. So they are kind of, reflections, they are mimesis of the actual relations. They are dominant material relations grasped as ideas. Now, all these, words of Marx, or countered by Gramsci, because Gramsci does not, I mean, he corrects his own master, he corrects Marx in pointing out that the working class is not devoid of its own intellectuals. It is not devoid of its own ideas. It has a kind of an ideological battle with the upper class. And this is the battle for hegemony or the consent. So, not all forms of class struggle are confrontational. They are through dialogue, debate, continuous education, continuous battle on the intellectual ground. And so you have a kind of, and there are many other Marxists. Adorno, for example, he also does not agree with this at all. He does believe in certain autonomy that the artists have, intellectuals have, philosophers have, from the ruling ideas of epoch, as Marx calls them. Also, the idea that thought is a replica or imitation or mimesis of the reality is objected to by several Marxist practitioners of art like Brecht, who taught the audience the technique of alienation. So, the A effect, as it is known, in his epic theater. So, the idea is that you do not have to look at the art as mimesis of reality. You do not have to look at the ideas as of the ruling ideas as mimesis, direct reflection of reality, as much as a refraction of the reality, as much as distortion of reality. So, I'm purposely kind of, showing you how the Marxists differed from Marx in several fundamental ways as the Marxist theory progressed. Again, from preface to a contribution to the critique of political economy, and this is also an often quoted passage, Marx says, the mode of production of material life conditions the social, political, and intellectual life process in general. It is the social life which determines consciousness, and it is not the case that consciousness that determines social life. So, here Marx is negating any kind of agency to social, political, and intellectual life process, which Gramsci is going to assert, which Adorno is going to assert, which Brecht is going to assert. Because without this agency, transformation of society is impossible. If there is such a determinism, then you cannot hope to change the social structure in the direction that you want it to go. You will have to accept the things as they are. So this is one consequence of this kind of blanket determinism that Marx sometimes talks about. But you also have to realize the idea that I touched upon in the beginning of today's lecture, that Marx is a historicist, and he does believe that it is the entire corpus of ideas, institutions, culture that human beings have created. It is this which shapes his consciousness. So it is human world which shapes the human world. It is not the material world that Marx is talking about, the mode of production of material life condition. It's not something alien to human consciousness. That too is a product of human consciousness and human effort, human labor. So for Marx, the idea of consciousness that philosophers had, that of purely mental activity, is extended to man's material activity as well. That's why at one place Marx says that technology of any society is the psychology of that society. So when you see new kind of instruments, new techniques coming into being, you understand about the psychology of that particular society at that juncture in the history. So Marx has to be read very carefully. You can easily mislead yourself into believing that he is a determinist, he is a materialist, and you can reduce him to certain kind of positivism. So you have to guard against this kind of things. And the later thinkers may appear to have deviated from Marx, but I believe that Adorno, Lukács, Gramsci, Brecht, and others, in fact, captured what was at the heart of Marxist teaching. This deviation, the literal deviation, was spiritual assimilation, was spiritual coherence. So, this is what I would like to propose. But you can think about it in your own light. Marx at one place says that the material transformation of the economic conditions of production can be determined with the precision of natural science. So this is the kind of influence of scientific or scienticist positivist ideology on Marx himself. I mean, Marx was a person living in society, and it is difficult to assert that he was above all the ideologies or influences of the ideologies. So he does say that the material production can be studied with scientific precision, but the ideological forms such as legal, political, religious, aesthetic, or philosophic have to be studied in different way. So this kind of division between physical sciences and human sciences was something that Marx had accepted, but later Marxists may not accept that readily. So these are kind of some of the quotes that I wanted to bring to your notice to prepare you for later kind of advances made by Marxists in Marxist theory. Right. Now, I will go to a Russian Marxist called Voloshinov. He belonged to the formalist school. So, people like Shklovsky and Bakhtin, and some people say that Voloshinov and Bakhtin are more one and the same persons. So, he grapples with the idea of basis and superstructure, ideology and the material level of material production. And he says that how does one relate the two? Is there direct cause and effect relationship? Is there direct relationship of mimesis or reflection, that superstructure reflects the relations of production directly? Voloshinov refuses to do that. He says that the specific nature of the symbolic activity, the cultural activity, is basically symbolic activity. Material activity is a productive or pragmatic activity. So this symbolic or semiotic activity has its own specific nature. It has the material of semiosis, the words, signs, symbols, art objects. They have got their own nature and it should not be ignored. He says that one cannot have one-to-one correspondence between the material changes in the mode of production, and the changes in art. One cannot, locate a particular instance, particular theme in a novel, for example, and say that it reflects migration of laborers because there is a paucity of work. It is not a direct reflection of social reality in art, but the entire art form changes as the social mode of production changes. He says, I'm quoting him, the whole of ideological forms undergo changes and not specific units. So it is not the character or the psychology of the character which is going to undergo change, but the novel as a form is going to undergo change in a different kind of society. He further asserts that language also is a material kind of thing. And here he is following Marx very directly, because Marx also says that language is something very material. So, I mean, I'm here quoting him from the German ideology. I'm quoting Marx. Marx says that the production of ideas, of conceptions, of consciousness is at first directly interwoven with the material activity and the material intercourse of men, the language of real life. So, the language of real life, I mean, the life itself is semiotic. You can have two meanings of this phrase, the language of real life. Language spoken in real life, and the real life as a language, as a semiotic activity. So, this is material. According to Marx, it is interwoven with the material world, material production. The language is not something which is mental in the Marxist framework. In you will not find many Marxist thinkers who say that language is something which is immaterial or mental. It is very physical. I mean, later you can, add to this even some non-Marxist thinkers who talk about signifiers, and the signifiers also material things. They're actual signs on the page, or they are sounds produced by your vocal cords. So they are material things in a society, and they are also important means to organize people into the activity of cooperative production of our wealth. So, since language is material, it is sensitive to changes in the production relations and socio-political order. This is what Voloshinov is saying, and he is expanding on Marx rather than deviating from the original Marx. I mean, if you do not take Marx in mechanistic positivist way, then you will find that Voloshinov is expanding on Marx. So he says that there are three relations that language has with the world. One is that it can be an ideology. Second is that it is a sign, it is a concrete form of social intercourse. And third, it is a form of communication. Now, all these form, the society affects language. Language is socially accentuated. Existence gets refracted in sign. It is kind of, it has its stamp on the sign, its stamp on the form of communication, because you are using language to communicate, to get the day-to-day activities done. So how can it be? And it is the same language which is used in literature. So the language of literature is not a pure literary language. It is the language which has come from society. It's a social fact. It's a social entity. And since it is a social entity, it is something that is going to reflect the society. But there is no direct reflection, because there is one qualification. And qualification is that society is not homogeneous. It is a heterogeneous society. It is a divided society. Since society is divided, the reflection that takes place in language is a fragmented reflection or distorted reflection. It is a refraction. Why is it a refraction? Because of the class struggle in society, because the existence of two classes in the society. It is the classes with different interests. All of them speak the same language. So how can language be a version, pure reflection of reality? This is what Voloshinov says. Now, from Voloshinov, I'll go to, in such a short span, I cannot do justice to Marxist literary theory, let me admit, because the time is less and the area is too vast. You can do kind of, your lifetime's work in this area itself, because each of these thinkers, and there are several thinkers, small and big, each of them have contributed significantly, very insightfully to this field. So I'll be making rather arbitrary selection based upon my own inclinations, which you may not agree with, in choosing the thinkers that I'm going to deal with today. And also, I'm not going to deal with each thinker properly and in a comprehensive way, because this is a sort of just, the purpose of this set of lectures, two lectures, is only to introduce you to Marxist literary theory and not give a complete authoritative account of it. So I, in that sense, justify what I'm doing, though I know I'm not very satisfied with this. Lukács Lukács is a very he was a voluminous writer and he wrote in several areas. He was a literary critic, but he was also a philosopher, historian of philosophy, a sociologist, and politician too. For a brief period, he was a minister in his country's government. So, George Lukács, all these figures that I'm going to talk about belong to the early part of the 20th century. So, these are not the contemporary thinkers, contemporary Marxist thinkers. I'm not talking about, because these are kind of, basic Marxist thinkers that one has to know before going to the latest or more modern theoreticians. Now, George Lukács, he takes up this idea of alienation of man and generalizes it to a, a kind of a condition of modern society in which this is a kind of medieval scholastic idea of reification, the idea of abstraction from the concrete reality and substituting this abstraction for the reality. This is the idea, basic idea of reification. He says that modern capitalist society is a reified society because it is a commodity producing society and it has a phantom objectivity. Instead of direct relation between people, between worker and the user of that work, say, for example, between, say, a farmer and a human being who needs that food that the farmer produces, what you have is you have autonomous relation of objects to other objects of production. So autonomy of the market relation replaces the direct human contact. In earlier societies, what you have is a kind of, uh, the servitude and the legal, religious, hierarchical, social structure had concealed the domination of producers, domination of the working class. But in the modern society, there is only a universal category, one universal category of commodity, and which is a kind of a legal and economic category, and that rules all production. So there is no kind of, loyalty, there is no kind of tradition, but it is an apparent free market where labor also is a commodity, as well as the product of labor also is commodity, and labor gets replaced by its own product. This is a contradiction. So how can a creative ability be replaced, be uh, bartered for the product of that creative ability? But this contradiction is the basic contradiction of commodity production, and this commodity production becomes the common universal category, and where the human labor, that is human creative capacity, also becomes an inert thing or the object. As a result, what happens is the relation of producers to their own labor is presented as a social relation between the products of their labor. So you get a kind of an illusory world where your ability to produce things is completely hidden, and it is replaced by the relation of one product, social product, with another social product through the intermediary of money. So instead of direct exchange of products, what you have is an abstraction of that production in the form of money, and money is exchanged for money. Money appears to be producing money, wealth appears to be producing wealth, and the commodity appears to be producing commodity. Human labor is conveniently relegated to the background. The laborer is paid for the laboring power, not for the work that is produced, for the capacity to work. And this capacity to work is also not exactly looked at as a creative activity, but only as matter of survival or matter of existence. So you get paid for your ability to work the next day. So you are given the survival wages so that you can continue working the next day. Now, survival is very different than the ability to produce things. But ability to produce things is very mysteriously hidden, and you have a kind of, the countable, the measurable commodities which are required for survival of the worker, that is considered to be the uh, value of exchange value of the labor. So this kind of alienation from one's own labor, I mean, I'm going over and again these grounds, because this is something very basic to understanding Lukash's criticism or literary critical approach. Labor creates capital and it confronts him as an alien kind of a thing. The whole world gets commodity character. The whole world is abstracted into the counting of labor hours and prices of things, not use values but exchange values. And the qualitative understanding, qualitative life is turned into a quantitative mode. How are you going to measure the lesson that you learn in a college. How are you going to measure somebody playing a flute? But it becomes measurable. A flute player or a singer is paid, an executive is paid, a magistrate is paid, and a worker also is paid. Everybody is paid. How can you measure work? How can you measure lives? But everything becomes measurable. And the common measuring rod is money. So you get a kind of an illusion that it is money which produces money. As a result, what happens is all human beings, though they are working frantically for their survival, about the whole society, they have a contemplative attitude. They feel helpless and passive as the world goes by, as the changes happen. And this is what all of us experience, especially in societies which are not much to our liking. So what you feel is that you are just witnesses, and you try to comprehend, and the whole effort, whole lifespan goes only in understanding, not changing the world. And that's why Marx talked about interpreting the world and changing it. The entire kind of human existence in a capitalist society is in a contemplative attitude. Lukács is going to make much of this contemplative attitude and this alienation when he is going to criticize the modernist writers. I'm going to come to that immediately. He also says that there is a fragmentariness. So, as there is a division of labor, separate spheres of existence, separate spheres of labor come into being. And each sphere is quite strictly regulated. But relation of one sphere of life to another sphere is very arbitrary, and there is rationalization at a micro level and a complete irrational anarchy at a macro level. So there is chance. I mean, you do not know how markets are going to behave. You have to speculate. You do not know what is the use of your education. You just trust that this will give you necessary skills or necessary knowledge to for future life. So the examination is very well regulated. The portions are, I'm taking examples from academia, because that is the field that both you and me are very familiar with, and that is also a sphere of capitalist production. So the entire examination system, entire syllabus making is highly regulated by various agencies, and new agencies keep coming up to regulate it. But what is the place of this education in wider society? Nobody seems to have any answer to it. So there is rationality in your immediate world, and there is irrationality in the totality. So this is kind of very brief summary of this important essay that Lukács wrote, Reification and Consciousness of the Proletariat. Now, how does he use this to talk about modern literature? As I told you, Lukács was also a modern critic. He was not just a philosopher, but he was also a critic. He considers the literature written in his times, is very unhappy with that literature. And he compares it with the literature written in the early centuries of capitalism, that is the 18th and 19th century. And he says that in the early days of bourgeois ascendancy, the literature was more perceptive, more intelligent than modern literature of his time, the modernist literature, the experimental literature. And especially on his radar are the surrealists, German expressionists, modernists, stream of consciousness novelists, the existentialist novelists like Kafka, and naturalists like Zola. So all these, avant-garde movements, Lukács targets, he criticizes as being completely subjected to the capitalist reification and abstraction and passivity and so on and so forth. Irrationalism. I mean, he kind of, there's a plethora of uh, accusations that he heaps on this cult in modern writing. For him, the great novelists, such as Sir Walter Scott, who was a historical novelist, then Victor Hugo, Balzac, Tolstoy, Flaubert, Dickens, and so on, were realist and they had an understanding of totality. I mean, just now I told you how the capitalist refiled world fragments life, how it breaks life into pieces, and people cannot make sense of the whole. And this inability to make sense of the whole gives birth to certain irrationalism and a recording of the immediate sensual experiences. Whereas the realist novels had a wide compass, they had a panoramic view of the world. And though by class they belonged to the bourgeois class, majority of them, none of them were working class writers, so at least they did not remain, though they may have originated in working class, they did not remain in the working class for long. Their natural allegiance in the class struggle in the society should have been towards the bourgeois class. But because they were honest artists and they understood the society in a comprehensive, total manner, they could understand the historical tendencies of capitalism, of the uh, beginnings of capitalist society. And so they could portray the whole picture of the dehumanization that is caused by capitalism in very kind of, intellectually respectable way. So these people did not experiment. They reflected the world as it was, but in a comprehensive and artistically mediated way. They understood it and they called spade the spade. The only writer, modern writer, that he admires is Thomas Mann, who, though he belonged to the early 20th century, did not experiment with narrative techniques. I mean, Lukács is basically against various narrative techniques. And this is a kind of, problematic aspect of his. I'm going to come to criticism of Lukács by two of his contemporaries, Marxist contemporaries. One is Bloch, Ernst Bloch, and another is Bertolt Brecht. But before that, let us try to understand what he's saying about modernist people. What he says is that the modernist writers such as James Joyce and Kafka are so pessimistic and so lost, so defeated by the society that they go deep into their minds and write psychological kind of or physical or sensual kind of stuff, that they do not try to comprehend the society as a whole, but they just record their immediate experiences of despondency, of pessimism, narcissism, or animality, physicality, as in the case of Joyce, the fear, the paranoia, as in the case of Kafka and German expressionists. or psychological fantasies, as in the case of surrealists. So these are kind of, they are kind of, giving rein to their internal neurosis. Their world is fragmentary, paranoid, and sick. I mean, Lukács fails to, in a way, understand the kind of society that these people were, the kind of advanced stage of capitalism and capitalist imperialism, the kind of immense growth in the social economic sphere, and proportional weakening of individual in the early 20th century, and which is continuing even today with us, that individual is becoming weaker and smaller day by day, and the systems are getting larger. So this kind of, whole uh, compelling nature of social forces is something that Lukács fails to see. Lukács fails to see the kind of appropriateness of the responses of modernist writers to their times, and the protest that is involved in their inversion, in their introspection, in their interiorization of reality. He also, the experimentation is something that, along with the change in the focus that happened from realism to modernist experimentation, modernist uh, techniques of writing. So Lukács is kind of, antithetical to even the experimentation that is done in literature. He feels that literature or novel, and his favorite form is novel. I mean, he was always a critique of novel rather than drama or poetry. And that also has influenced his way of his aesthetics, his literary theory, because novel is more popular form, and novel is closer to the kind of narrative traditions, whereas the great experiments have taken place in the world of drama and poetry, which were matched rather slowly and not sufficiently in novella. So Lukács always has a kind of, uh, kind of, novel as his favorite form, where he can, beat up the later day novelists for their experimentation in narrative techniques and their change in the priorities of attention. He calls them, this novel writing of modernist writers, as abstract and one dimensional. What does he mean by that? For him, one dimensional means that it is too personal, it is not social, it is psychological, and it is physical. It is uh, it is engrossed in individual psychology at the cost of attention to entire society. The technique of montage, which came about because the world itself was fragmented and world itself was heterogeneous. World could not be portrayed in a coherent way. So this technique of montage is criticized squarely by Lukács. So Lukács is a great anti-modernist, bases his criticism on Marxist theory or his understanding of Marxism. Now this has its own blind spots. Let us look at them very carefully. Lukács, for one, cannot distinguish between the artistic discourse and philosophical or social scientist discourse. For him, the main idea of any kind of use of language is the main purpose behind any kind of use of language is epistemology, that it should give knowledge. He does not look at art as a separate sphere of human activity. And he does not see the relative autonomy of art, despite the totalization and exaggerated socialization that capitalism had effected. So Lukács is in a way blind to both the autonomy of art as well as the uh, different objectives that different spheres of life would have. That is one. Second is his allegation that modernist people have not understood the world well is quite superficial, because it is not only at the level of content but even at the level of form that the modernists have understood the world, in fact much better than their realist predecessors, because realist predecessors had created at least some illusion of coherence in narration, and modernist writers forego that. They had foregone that. They had declared that any kind of coherent narration is impossible, because the world itself is so fragmentary and the world itself is so incoherent. At the same time, there was a heroic assertion of human individuality in the modernist writing, which Lukács fails to see. So these are the kind of, some of the criticisms that one can make of Lukács's understanding of modernist world and the unfairness of it. When Ernst Bloch and Bertolt Brecht took issues with Lukács, and there was a quite heated debate among them, a very kind of, public debate about literature and function of literature and all these kinds of issues. Both these people, adversaries Bloch and Brecht, did point out to these basic faults of Lukács's position. Brecht, in fact, went so much to say that Lukács is against any kind of production. He operates as an apparatchik, as a judge, and he does not realize that artist has to continuously produce, and production is going to require experimentation, certain dealing with form, different kinds of forms. Bloch also points out that Lukács rarely talks about the expressionist paintings, which depicted the horrible reality. So if you look at Munch or Chagall or Klee, then you see these kind of, the horrible distortion of reality in their paintings. Lukács does not talk much about that. Lukács only talks about certain convenient authors and keeps this allegation of moral weakness and intellectual weakness. He does not do enough justice to the strengths of avant-garde experimentations of the modernist, various modernist schools, such as symbolists, expressionists, cubists, surrealists, etc. So these are the objections to criticisms that were made by Brecht and Bloch against Lukács. Now I'll go to a very a great thinker who belong to this branch of Marxism called Western Marxism. His work is very comprehensive. It's in various several fields. He was a philosopher. He was the topmost music critic of his time. He was a culture critic. He was a sociologist, and he was also a literary theorist and an aesthetician. He is Theodor Adorno. Theodor Adorno, along with Horkheimer, Leo Lowenthal, Walter Benjamin, uh, Marcuse, Erich Fromm, Herbert Marcuse, Erich Fromm, and Habermas belong to a philosophical study school in almost a university, a kind of privately funded university called Frankfurt School. All these thinkers that I took names of have made important contribution to literature and criticism. I'm going to Adorno also, just one among them, wrote several books called Dialectic of Enlightenment, Culture Industry, Minima Moralia, Prisms, Aesthetic Theory, Negative Dialectics, and so on and so forth. He talked about Heidegger, Husserl. So he was a kind of, mainstream philosopher. He talked about metaphysics and ethics and politics. I mean, he also talked about the entire phenomenon of fascism and Nazism. And he wrote a huge book called Authoritative Personality, which was based on sociological survey of people's attitude towards the leader, and which will be quite relevant to us in today's world. So his survey called Authoritative Personality, which was about entire kind of European experience of dictators. So he was a kind of a multifaceted thinker. I'm going to deal with only one essay by Adorno called On Lyric Poetry and Society. But before that, let me tell you, something about his major thesis. His thesis in Dialectic of Enlightenment, which he wrote with his friend and fellow thinker called Max Horkheimer, he talks about the birth of aggressive rationality and how this rationality tries to subsume object under the spell of the subject. I mean, just as a ferocious animal hunts his prey and eats it up and completely demolishes it, uh, completely appropriates it. In the same way, human beings have, moment they started thinking, and Adorno takes it way back to the times of Greek philosophy, Plato. So he says that entire European attitude towards the world, the nature first, and then society, and then towards the self, is that of aggression and appropriation. This is something very similar to the Weberian Max Weber's concept of instrumental rationality. So rationality, which is not to understand, but to appropriate and control. So this entire enlightenment, which is a long process, not just 17th and 18th century process, but it begins with the birth of philosophy itself, is a comprehensive enmity and hostility towards the world, including the self. Because when you start being hostile to nature and hostile to the other human beings, you can't escape being hostile to your own selves. So this hostility towards the self is and the division that takes place within the fragmentation that takes place of an individual, because the human being has waged war against himself, is the is the subject of his great book called Dialectic of Enlightenment. Then in his culture industry, he talks about how the modern mass culture, in his days, radio and television and newspapers were there. Mobiles, thankfully, were not there. Internet was not there. But even with the advent of cinema, the popular cinema, the television, the advertisements, the news, the newspaper, uh, uh, horoscopes, he analyzes various cultural phenomena and show how repetitive and stupefying they are, how they make the people stupid, how they make the people live with a certain monochromous and monotonous kind of a world, how they're boring, and how they diminish your capacity to reflect upon things by continuous bombardment of sensory inputs, and so on and so forth. So this is the kind of basic idea that he talked about in culture industry. Now I'm going to talk about his views on literature. He wrote several essays on literature, which are collected together in a book called Notes of Literature. And one very famous essay from these Notes of Literature is The Lyric Poetry and Society. Now, I purposefully chosen this essay because lyric poetry, because I want to put Adorno against Lukács, and how can you understand the phenomenon of subjectivity that Lukács regards to be so low from another perspective, from different perspective. That is what I want to kind of show it to you. Lyric poetry is a very kind of personal kind of poetry. It is a very subjective expression. Now, Adorno talks about relation of society with lyric poetry and says that lyric poetry, though appears to be very personal, very private, is completely steeped in the social awareness and social consciousness. So it is not an escape from social obligations and social commitment, but in fact a response to the totalizing agencies in society in a very heroic kind of a way. He begins his argument by saying that social element is essential to the quality of lyric. Now, here he uses Hegelian logic of dialectics, relationship between the specific and the universal. And he says that more specific, if you have to be, then you have to participate more and more in universals. Hegel talks about the specificness of an object and shows that all the specific qualities of an object are made up by universals such as colors, the shape, the size, the weight, and so on and so forth. So this dialectic between specificity and universal, Adorno makes much of in his analysis of lyric poetry. So when you are unrestrained in individuation, when lyric poetry, a lyric writer, and most of modern Marathi poetry, even modern European and English poetry, is basically a lyric poetry. So that is a major genre of poetry. So this lyric has an unrestrained individuation, and more inside you go, more open you are to the universal forces. Because what happens in a lyric poetry is it tries to give expression to that element which is not yet subsumed by totality, which is not yet grasped by the totalizing forces of uh, intellectual management. What Althusser will call, ideological apparatus. So it is that aspect of man which has yet escaped colonization by the market forces, by capitalism. It is that which a lyric poet tries to, you know, deal with. A poem, as it is written in solitude, and it is about solitude, you can hear the whole humankind in it. Now, lyric poetry can there be only in modern times when the society has become individualistic and made up of atom-like individuals. Now, how do you understand lyric? You have to, here he is almost formulaic. He gives a formula to understand lyric, and I'm going to read him. He says, one has to discover how the entirety of a society as an internally contradictory system is manifested in the work. And for that, you require not a transcendental approach. You cannot take concepts, and here, you will recollect easily Voloshinov, that you have to understand its own logic, the immanent logic. You cannot, take concepts from outside and apply it to lyric. Say that, here the poet lives in a big city, and that's why, the metropolitan consciousness can be seen in his poem. You have to start from the poem and then go towards the social categories rather than other way around. Just because somebody is a Dalit writer or a black writer, he or she does not have to express. It is not mandatory upon him to express the Dalit consciousness. You can't carry over these concepts from outside to the inside of poetry. You have to start from the literary object and subtly analyze it and derive from it some understanding of society. So this is an immanent approach that he is advocating. Now, he says that this solitary, private activity of writing a poem is not ideological, because ideology is false consciousness, and only in the failed works of art you can see the traces of ideologies. When a work of art does not stand as work of art, you have to bolster it by seeing ideology in it, whether it is the ideology of protest or whether it is ideology of confirmation. But in a successful work of art, there is truth, its own truth, and that's why it is not ideological. He says, and I'm quoting him, the great art voices what ideology hides. So, the I in a lyric is a rejection of collectivity and also, in a way, recreation of nature and collectivity, which is lost in society through immersion in himself. So, I mean, here again, there is a great dialectical way of thinking that Adorno has. He is talking about the mediation of individual by universal and mediation of universal by individual. The language that is used in lyric poetry is not the communicative language. It is a very personal and private language. But language is always individual. All language is spoken by some individual or another. At the same time, the concepts in language are universal or common to all mankind. So language has got this double character. It is subjective as well as it is conceptual. When individual poet submits himself to the language, then he expresses something which is most individual, but this individual contains all that is social in it, social in the language. Because the individual and social are contradistinguished, are distinguished only in comparison with each other. So this kind of identification with language, the poet, I mean, this is very interesting, this observation, is rejecting both his status as a monad, as a single atom, and also excessive socialization, because he does not want to communicate anything. He has given way to the language. He allows the language to speak through him. So his kind of private expression, which is not controlled in an instrumental fashion by the needs of communication, because language is reduced to the level of a slave by a capitalist society, where the entire burden of communication is on the language. So this burden is thrown away by a lyric poet, and he allows the language to speak through him. It is a kind of an automatic writing. It is, but more controlled a society, more totalizing the society. And as all societies develop and go from modern to postmodern stage, your consciousness gets more and more controlled by the technical and capitalist apparatus such as internet and mobile and WhatsApp and so on and so forth. So more controlled a society, more precarious is the, and more kind of, irrational the lyric becomes. Lyric appears to be purposeless. So this is the kind of, saddest part in Adorno's understanding or explanation of what lyric is. So these were the kind of, this is just one essay that I dealt with by Adorno. In his aesthetic theory, he elaborates all this more philosophically, more conceptually. And, this is what kind of, criticism, this is the kind of, the best Marxist criticism that you can come across. So nuanced, so sophisticated, and so sympathetic of the modern writing. Now, to end, I'm going to deal briefly with an Italian thinker who lived in relative intellectual isolation called Gramsci, but I'm not going to go in depth. But here also, you see, Gramsci was influenced by Hegelian Marxism through the agency of Benedetto Croce, who was an aesthetician and his teacher. So Croce was quite a Hegelian. So Gramsci also, unlike Soviet Marxism or Stalinism, which was mechanical and which was deterministic and materialistic, did accept the agency of people. He did not think that, everything was historically and socially determined. So he did accept that there was agency in uh, society available to the working classes, howsoever uh, oppressed they are. So, even his picture of society was that there is a kind of a permanent, long drawn struggle between classes. He calls it war of positions as against the war of maneuvers. And he distinguishes the Eastern European societies in which the society was not very strong, but state was very strong, where revolution was possible because state was tottering on very weak foundations, weak social foundations. Whereas in the Western European societies, state was only one among the fortresses of society. Beyond and beneath the state, there were so many fortifications in the society. Society was so well distributed in hierarchies, in the structures of power, that you had to draw, you had to prolong the social struggle through the intellectual war of consent, which is called hegemony. And here, everybody, the working class, everybody could perform an intellectual role of an intellectual. So you are not determined by false consciousness or ideology once and for all, that your agency was completely annihilated by that false consciousness. But you had the freedom to become organic intellectuals as against the traditional intellectuals who are academicians. I mean, of course, and he says that traditional intellectuals are not your enemies. You have to learn from traditional intellectuals. But each class, social class, had its own organic intellectuals. And even ordinary priests, school teachers, everybody could be an organic intellectual. This was idea of Gramsci, and he also provides a great agency to uh, the common man, and he asserts the freedom of common man just as original Marx does. And without that freedom, literature is impossible. So today I'll deal with, today I will stop here. I know that I've left much of what Gramsci said, Adorno said, or Lucas said unsaid, unexplained, but for such a duration, only this much is possible. Thank you for listening to my lecture. If there are any questions, you can come up with them. Thank you.
Sir, actually, there are some questions. I'll make you
Yes,
available on screen. Please have it.
yes, please. Please show them. Yeah, yes, obviously, that is what I was. The question is George Lucas's idea of realism, does George Lucas's idea of realism help to unfold or help to unravel, reveal the underlying pattern of society? Yes, it does. That is what he said, that realistic novel was the best kind of novel because it saw the historical tendencies, the historical movements. So not, I mean, society not as a fixed kind of a structure, but as a dynamic process where the class ascendancies were continuously in turmoil. Instead of the earlier feudal class, new bourgeois capitalist class came into power. And all this was shown in the novels of great 19th century realists. Yes. Is there other question now? I think I've answered this.
Yeah, sir. There is one more question. Let me make you available.
Yeah.
Remember. Remember.
Right. So the finance capitalism is dealt with, or it is also called consumer capitalism, by the Marxist thinkers that I did not deal with. And these are Terry Eagleton and Frederick Jameson, to a degree, Edward Said, or Michel Foucault, if you can call Michel Foucault Marxist, Ejaz Ahmad in India, uh, Prabhat Patnaik. So, though he is not a literary critic, he is an economist, but all of them talk about consumer capitalism or financial capitalism and its effect in cultural life, and they equate the postmodernism with the postmodernism as culture of this consumer capitalism. One will have to deal with this issue in a separate lecture completely, because this is a vast issue, you know. So how kind of, a virtual reality, even Baudrillard, who started as a Marxist and tried to develop this, his idea of virtuality, his idea of, the hyper reality as a kind of, a supplement to the original Marxist understanding of capitalism, that in finance capitalism you see kind of, illusions as reality. So this kind of, warping out, or kind of, uh, weakening of the sense of real, and replacement of real by the images, the world of images, is something dealt with by all these thinkers. But we will, so it is not the case that Marxism has not dealt with these issues, but we will have to go into another set of lectures to talk about.
Okay, so uh, sir,
Am I audible, Rahul?
Yes, you
yeah,
are.
sir. Yeah, yeah.
I can hear you
Uh,
fully.
yeah. Are there any questions, Prakash?
No, no, sir. No question is left here.
Okay. So can I ask?
Yes, sir.
Can I ask?
Yes, please do. I'll be
Yeah.
happy to
Yeah,
listen
Rahul.
to.
Yeah.
Yes.
Uh, yeah. I'm very much happy that you spoke extensively on this idea. Really, I mean, it requires a series of lectures. Marxist literary theory is so rich, and there are contributors from across the world. I have a few questions. I will put them all together and hope that you respond to some of them. We are running short of time. Uh, there are two schools of thought which received criticism from within and outside. One is feminism, and the other one is Marxism. And
Yeah.
both of these schools of thought have been benefited more by the criticism within than by criticism outside. Marxism, we know there are scholars such as Gramsci and Althusser who had differences with some of the basic assumptions on which Marxism was based.
Yeah.
And there is some amount of democracy seen in this kind of development of Marxist theory. But despite that all, we find Marxism and Marxist literary theory kept on receiving a great amount of adversity from the mainstream literary critics and mainstream literary circles. it was called as say very narrow and very deterministic and also judgmental and sometimes excessively ideological. So how do you look at this kind of criticism of Marxist school of thought, or we can say Marxist literary criticism? Does it really become sometimes highly judgmental and emerges as a sort of say meta narrative which reduces any space for say other possibilities? This is one.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Can I
See,
ask one more? Or would
I
you like?
think that I like to answer this question because this is a comprehensive question in itself, and
Yeah.
yes,
Try to
I'll
be
try to
brief.
answer. I'll try to be brief. Now, what you say, Dilip, is true about Soviet criticism under the leadership of Stalin and Zhdanov, and Chinese or Maoist kind of party controlled cultural activity. So, wherever there was state intervention uh, in Marxist kind of thought, you had these kind of you know dogmatic and pedagogically unsound kind of principles uh, erupting in literary criticism. Also, these societies, Chinese and Russian, were hardly and are hardly Marxist or communist societies. They are basically, at the most, one can say they are state capitalist societies. So they are totalitarian societies, and the basic principle of Marxism, that is yesterday I elaborated a lot about it, the freedom, the specificity, rejection of totalization, rejection of universality is absent in these. But wherever you see an honest Marxist thinker, and you see quite a few of them among Western Marxists, what is known as Western Marxism. So you have the entire kind of galaxy of thinkers, the Frankfurt School. I talked about several thinkers belonging to Frankfurt School. I'll not repeat their names. Gramsci, who was influenced by Croce, Althusser, who was influenced by Freud and Lacan, and even Derrida, who calls himself Marxist to a certain degree, a disciple of Marx. Foucault is influenced by Marx. In fact, I would say that Marxist literary theory is not a minority, but majority of mainstream, advanced, sophisticated literary theories, literary criticism are colored by insights of Marxism. So if you read carefully Adorno, you will find that you have many ideas which later Derrida talked about, which later other thinkers talked about, are there in Adorno himself. So I would say that, if you look at British Marxist school, say of cultural studies of Stuart Hall and Raymond Williams, and British literary theorists such as Terry Galton and Frederick Jameson. These are all big names. Edward Said, all these are very big names. Ejaz Ahmad, and they have contributed a lot there. None of them is dogmatic. They are very sensitive to the subject to which they are studying at that time. They do not universalize. They do not have a meta narrative. They are very sophisticated. So one can see that there are two different kinds of Marxist traditions of thought. One is state controlled, state sponsored, and highly censorious, like Soviet and Chinese models, and another is the model in which Marxist theory is still developing. In fact, many new Marxist thinkers are looking at religion and environment, nature, from a more kind of profound, deeper perspective, philosophical perspective. So you cannot equate atheism with Marxism. You cannot equate the idea of progress which with Marxism. So, they are removing the positivistic and scientistic kind of vestiges which had sort of polluted Marxist thought, and they are trying to remove it and trying to make it more interesting and more exciting. That is my
Yeah,
answer.
thank you very much.
Yeah,
I had a four questions on mine, but now just 4 minutes to 8, and I think we should keep time and we should close this session before it is 8.
yeah.
So, yeah, on behalf of the School of Language, Literature and Culture Studies, I thank Dr. Rahul Pungaliya for having delivered 2 lectures. I hope all of you have enjoyed these talks, and I hope that we continue to have critical engagement with the ideas such as Marxian literary theory. Uh, the School of Language, Literature and Culture Studies is going to organize a few more lectures in the days ahead. These lectures are going to be delivered by Dr. Madhuri Dikshit. She's from Ahmednagar and she'll be speaking on cultural studies. Dr. Madhavi Nikam, she's from Mumbai and she will be speaking on cultural studies. Uh, Dr. Trupti Karekatti, she's from Shivaji University, Kolhapur, and she will be speaking on feminism and literature. Dr. Bajrang Bihari from Delhi University, he will be speaking on Dalit Hindi literature and the state. Mustajib Khan from Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar, Marathwada University, Aurangabad, he is going to speak on Indian English drama and alternative theatre. Dr. Kashinath Barade also is going to speak on Adivasi language and culture. And Dr. Santosh Sonkar from Indira Gandhi National Tribal University, Amakantak, he is going to speak on Indian English drama. So these lectures are primarily meant for the students of the School of Language, Literature and Culture Studies of Swami Ramanand Teerth, Marathwada University. Some of these lectures will be arranged through this Google Meet, and a couple of them will be on YouTube. Hope that you join the Telegram channel, that is SLLCS events, so that you can remain associated with this school, and we can keep informing about the events to come. So at the end, I thank all the participants, and again, Dr. Rahul for delivering these lectures, and I declare that the session is over. So thank you once again.